What's up, guys? Nuance Bro checking in, and today we're going to be talking about Trump's comments on birthright citizenship and his executive order. But first, if you would like to support this channel, please consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. And not only will you help support more videos like this, but you will gain access to exclusive video clips, our members-only Discord, as well as other perks. So please go to www.patreon.com/nuancebro to become a patron today. So Axios on HBO published a video today about their interview with Trump, and here's what Trump said.
On immigration, some legal scholars believe you can get rid of birthright citizenship without changing the Constitution.
With an executive order.
Exactly.
Right.
Have you thought about that?
Yes.
Tell me more.
It was always told to me that you needed a constitutional amendment.
Right.
Guess
14th
what?
Amendment.
You don't.
You don't.
Number one, you don't need that. Number two,
I mean, that's in dispute.
You could definitely
That's very much in dispute.
Well, you can definitely do it with an act of Congress, but now they're saying I can do it just with an executive order. Now, how ridiculous! We're the only country in the world where a person comes in, has a baby, and the baby is essentially a citizen of the United States for 85 years with all of those benefits. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous, and it has to end.
Have you talked about that with counsel?
Yeah. I have.
So where in the process?
It's in the process. It'll happen.
So you can see the interviewer asked Trump about birthright citizenship, and he asked if he's thought about it, and Trump talks about how he has and how an executive order is in the process of going through. And he talked about legal scholars and their opinions on it and how they said you could definitely do it through an act of Congress, but that you could also do it through executive order. So what's the truth about this? Well, we're going to talk about the actual facts of the matter, and then we're going to talk about the realistic implications of the matter. So let's start out with the realistic implications. If Trump does this with his executive order, what's going to happen? Well, organizations like the ACLU have already come out saying that this is absolutely unacceptable and unconstitutional, and that they would immediately file a lawsuit if this ever went into effect. Also, other states like California and New York most likely would enter into lawsuits saying that this is totally unconstitutional and that the president has no authority to do this, that it violates the 14th Amendment, and that this affects many people within their states, and they would just say it violates decades of precedent. Now, what would most likely happen as a result of this is a preliminary injunction. What that is before a case can even be heard necessarily and ruled on, the court usually likes to side with the status quo, and they'll say, look, whatever's happening right now, we're going to keep that the way it is until this case goes forward, and then we'll decide whether this is actually constitutional or not. So almost immediately, this would pretty much be null and void, and anyone who's born here would still get citizenship or whatever until the legal matter is resolved. So the courts would likely come out and say, Trump, you have to stop this executive order for now. This isn't going to go through. And this happens in a lot of cases. For example, anytime a state tries to pass a pretty extreme law, or sometimes not even so extreme, but people are arguing that it's unconstitutional, they issue a preliminary injunction and say, look, this law is not going to go into effect until we rule on this matter. Now, the reason this would most likely happen is because of the way our federal court system is built. You have federal district courts, then you have federal courts of appeals, and then you ultimately have the Supreme Court. But when it comes to the federal district court, you're dealing with hundreds of judges, thousands actually. It's something almost like 3,000 in different districts. And people would be filing lawsuits from probably all over this country. And all it takes is one single judge to make some sort of preliminary injunction to stop this executive order for it to affect the entire country. But of course, the ruling of one federal district judge is not going to be determinative forever. Of course, as it goes up the ranks of federal district judge to Circuit Court of Appeals and then ultimately to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court is going to be the one that has the final say if things go up that high to begin with. Now let's talk about the legality of the executive order. Now, as far as I know, there is no federal law saying that illegal immigrants and their children become citizens. It's based on an interpretation of the 14th Amendment that talks about natural-born citizens that fall within the jurisdiction of the United States. So given that there's no federal law and that the administrative agencies that determine citizenship fall under the executive branch, an executive order could be the correct way to go about this, although ultimately the preferred route would be a congressional law. Now, some scholars say that Trump's executive order would be flat out unconstitutional because it would prohibit natural-born citizens from gaining citizenship. They would say that illegal immigrants coming here, having children, and those children not becoming citizens would violate the provision of the 14th Amendment that talks about natural born citizens. Now, there's really not a ton of precedent for that, and we're going to get into precedent in a second. But the idea that there's precedent for illegal immigrants coming here, having children, and those children becoming full-fledged citizens, there really isn't precedent for that. But the part that they tend to leave out is the other portion of the 14th Amendment where it talks about natural born citizens and naturalized citizens, but it says subject to the jurisdiction thereof. So let's talk about the specific 14th Amendment provision that talks about natural born citizenship. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the states wherein they reside. Now, as you can see, it has two different requirements, either all persons born or naturalized. So naturalization is obviously the process by which you go when you're not a citizen, but then you apply for citizenship and then you become a citizen through whatever laws we've determined that, makes you a citizen. But the other one is being born. But both of them are contingent upon being subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Now, what does that mean? Well, some people, the people who are opposed to the Trump executive action, are suggesting that it means, well, if you're within the United States and you're subject to our laws, as in, if you murder someone, you can be arrested for murder, or, you just commit some sort of crime, you're subject to the jurisdiction. We can take you to court and put you to prison. You're subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Now, others, people who are proponents for Trump's interpretation that would allow for something like this executive action, argue that if you are a foreigner and you fall under foreign laws, that you are not under the full jurisdiction of the United States. Now, this would apply to people like diplomats, for example. So diplomats, if they come here and they commit some sort of crime or whatever, they wouldn't necessarily be arrested because sometimes they have diplomatic immunity. This would also historically apply to native tribes. So when they were born, they wouldn't become U.S. citizens automatically because they are part of their own sort of nation, even though they're technically within the borders of the United States. And it's like a sort of quasi-independent nation, not exactly, but they argued that they weren't citizens, but that later changed, I think, somewhere in the 1920s. But there's a great article, Ben Shapiro just actually wrote it over on the Daily Wire, so we're going to quote some of that. So a portion of the article says, "The key phrase here is subject to the jurisdiction thereof. As Ilya Shapiro of Cato Institute points out, that phrase was originally written to exclude the children of Native American tribes from American citizenship, since those children were subject to the jurisdiction of Native American governance, as well as the children of foreign diplomats and soldiers from abroad fighting on American land. The amendment was specifically written in order to guarantee the citizenship of freed slaves and their children, in order to abrogate the Supreme Court's despicable Dred Scott ruling." Now, the article also goes into historical precedent about this issue. In 1884, the Supreme Court ruled that a Native American born under the jurisdiction of a Native American tribe could not unilaterally make himself a United States citizen, since no one can become a citizen of a nation without its consent. In 1898, the Supreme Court ruled that Wong Kim Ark, a child born in the United States to legal resident Chinese immigrants, was included in the birthright citizenship provided by the 14th Amendment. In 1982, the Supreme Court ruled that for a state to deny public benefits to the child of illegal immigrants would be illegal, Justice William Brennan noted in a footnote. Now, of the three cases, the last one is a little bit dicey because it was in a footnote, which is what in legal circles they call dicta. It's not really binding, but in the other two cases, you can see that they kind of fall on the opposite sides of things. So one talks about a legal resident falling under birthright citizenship under the 14th Amendment, but the former case in 1884 that ruled on the Native American born under the jurisdiction of a Native American tribe talked about how no one can become a citizen of a nation without its consent. So you could easily argue that the same sort of case applies to illegal immigrants who are not members of this nation. They're not citizens of this nation. They're not legal residents here, but they're actually from a foreign nation and they're entering illegally into this country. So therefore their child could also be considered not part of this jurisdiction or under our jurisdiction, that they're actually the responsibility and fall under the jurisdiction of a foreign nation. So ultimately, if this executive order goes through and Trump actually does sign it, he'll almost immediately be sued. There will almost certainly immediately be a preliminary injunction, which would stop the executive order from taking effect. And then this would battle out in the courts for probably years. And then maybe we'll get a definitive ruling from the Supreme Court on this. But ultimately, there has to be either legislation or probably an amendment. I don't think that the court would rule that such a law would be constitutional. Even the current Supreme Court that President Trump has appointed, I don't think that they would rule that this is constitutional, given the history that's gone on. And a lot of this does come down to your interpretation of the Constitution. There are some people who are originalists. There's some people who are what they call living constitutionalists, which almost kind of effectively renders the Constitution meaningless. But even of the originalists on the Supreme Court, or the textualists, or strict constructionists, whatever you want to call them, which are usually the conservative justices on the court, I don't even think they would approve or think that this is constitutional, given the history, given the legal precedent. But I do certainly think it can be argued, and I don't think it's completely out of bounds to suggest that illegal immigrants giving birth in this country, that their children wouldn't necessarily become citizens. Because as Trump said in the video, we are the only nation in the world that allows this. That's not technically true. I think he was talking about developed nations, but even then, Canada is the only exception other than us that allows for birthright citizenship. All the other developed countries in the world don't have birthright citizenship, so we are an exception to the rule, it seems. There are some non-developed countries, especially here, in Central America and South America. They have some birthright citizenship statutes, but we seem to be the exception. And it's fair to say that when the 14th Amendment was written, they weren't thinking about, or they certainly didn't intend for this to apply to illegal immigrants who are coming here and giving birth to children, and those children being citizens. Because, they're not talking about separating families, saying, okay, well, you're a citizen, you're born here at 1 year old, but we're going to deport your parents. I mean, no rational person would think that would be the case, or the purpose of the 14th Amendment to allow for a circumstance or a situation like that to happen. So that's the end of the video, guys. Let me know what you thought. Do you think that Trump's executive order would be constitutional, or do you think Congress needs to take action? And even if Congress did take action, would that be constitutional, or would there have to be an entire new amendment process and basically write out that portion of the 14th Amendment and put in a new version that wouldn't allow for birthright citizenship? Let me know your thoughts. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support me on Patreon. Social media links are in the description box below, as well as merch. And I'll see you next time, bro.